On March 10, 1963, Prime Minister Mohammad Daoud Khan resigned and King Zahir Shah took the lead in ruling Afghanistan. Daoud had been close to the Soviet Union and had undertaken the first steps in modernizing Afghanistan, inaugurating vast development projects mostly carried out with the support of foreign countries. He had been unpopular with conservative Afghans, and religious leaders and their followers hoped that the country would return to Islamic principles with Zahir Shah in power. In 1959, Daoud, along with several members of the royal family and the deputy prime minister, had appeared in public with his wife and daughter unveiled. Even though no official announcement was made, the tradition of purda, the customary veil worn by women, was metamorphosing in Kabul and in other major cities. The young legal advisors of Daoud, who had been trained at Cairo's Al-Azhar Seminary and continued their education at universities in Switzerland, France, and the United States, had concluded that the practice of purda could not be justified under Islamic law. This public display, while welcomed by the westernized urban middle class, was understood by rural conservatives as a direct attack on their traditional customs and religious values. A delegation of religious clergymen accused Daoud of being against Islam and of promoting Western values. Several members of the delegation were illiterate mullahs from the countryside. As Olivier Roy has explained, the village mullahs were traditionalists for the most part. The arguments put forward by Daoud and his legal advisors drew on their foreign education, and the rural clergy regarded them as atheists and Western sympathizers. Zahir Shah continued with Daoud's reforms and disappointed much of the religious leadership. The passing of a new constitution in 1964, for example, allowed a host of new media outlets to start operating. This, in turn, saw an opening up of the media space, with fewer restrictions on what those outlets were allowed to broadcast or print. While the impact on rural communities of such policies was marginal, they found considerable resonance among those in the cities, and particularly in Kabul. By the beginning of the 1970s, the relative calm present until then throughout Afghanistan had begun fraying at the edges. Both communism and Islamism as its counter-reaction were active political forces in Kabul and among educated urban elites. Foreign governments were increasingly engaging in domestic Afghan affairs, though Soviet influence was disproportionate. In 1970, 7,000 Afghan army officers were being trained in the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia, while only 600 were trained in the United States. Financially, Afghanistan was a recipient of massive Soviet economic aid, totaling $1.265 billion by 1979. Both ideologies were subject to considerable variety and extreme positions. For some, communism was merely a vehicle to reach power, while others were true followers. Among the Islamists, some advocated peaceful, nonviolent opposition, while others took action, like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who served time in prison for the murder of a Maoist supporter. The Islamists in Kabul had formed around new ideas brought from abroad. Afghan religious scholars educated in Egypt at the famous Al-Azhar Seminary now returned home to find their country to be weak and backward, with much of its political elite adopting communism. These religious clerics set up groups that would form an opposition to the communists. The most famous at the time was that of Maulana Muhammad Ataullah Faizani. It was, however, the group that coalesced around Ghulam Muhammad Niazi, whose members would rise to prominence and shape Afghanistan's future.